I found out 3 weeks after the funeral, sitting in a lawyer's office I hadn't been invited to, that my signature was on a document I never signed, transferring my 40% share of my mother's estate into an account I had never heard of. The number on the page was $1,880,000. My sister Anata had already spent $214,000 of it on a down payment for a lake house in her husband's name. I want to start at the beginning because if I just tell you the ending, you won't believe how far she was willing to go, and you won't understand why. When I finally showed up at her door 11 months later holding a single manila folder, she actually laughed at me. She laughed right up until I opened it. My name doesn't matter for this story, so I'll just tell you I'm the older one. Renata is 2 years younger. Growing up, people always said we were close, and for a long time that was true. We shared a room until I was 14. We used to write notes to each other in a shoebox we kept under the bed, little folded pieces of paper that said things like, "You're my best friend," and "Don't tell Mom I ate the last cookie." I still have that shoebox. I'll come back to that. Our mother, Dolores, built a small property management company from nothing in the 80s, back when nobody was giving loans to a divorced woman with 2 kids and a 10th grade education. She used to tell us the story so often we could recite it along with her. How she walked into 3 different banks in 1 week wearing her one good blazer, how the third loan officer, a man named Walter, looked at her business plan for a long time before finally saying, "You remind me of my sister," and my sister was right about everything she ever bet on. That loan, $22,000 in 1984, bought her first 4-unit building. By the time she got sick, that company owned 11 buildings across 3 counties, worth, altogether, somewhere around $6.1 million, plus another $600,000 in savings and investments. Our mother died on a Tuesday morning in March, 4 days before that photograph I mentioned earlier, the one from Mateo's 5th birthday, would have marked exactly 4 years since it was taken, a coincidence I only noticed much later, and that means nothing. Probably, except that grief makes you notice things like that. Small alignments that feel like they should mean something even when they don't. I want to tell you about the deposition, Renata's own deposition, because Cassandra let me watch it from behind a one-way arrangement that isn't quite how television makes it look, more like sitting in an adjoining room with a video feed, but close enough to the spirit of it that I think you'll understand what I mean. It was 5 months before the actual hearing, part of the discovery process, Renata under oath, her attorney beside her, a court reporter typing quietly in the corner. For the first 40 minutes, she was composed, almost rehearsed, answering Cassandra's questions about the timeline of events with the kind of careful, minimal responses her attorney had clearly drilled into her. Yes. No. I don't recall. Then Cassandra pulled out the spreadsheet, the one titled Plan, and asked Renata to explain the column labeled Target Percent, and I watched, through that video feed, something in my sister's face change in a way I had genuinely never seen before. Not in 34 years of knowing her. It wasn't guilt, exactly. It was closer to the expression of someone watching a wall they'd built very carefully start to develop a crack they hadn't accounted for. Her answer, when it finally came, was that the spreadsheet was just brainstorming, that she'd been stressed and scared during the diagnosis and had made a document to help herself process the financial reality of what might happen, and that the specific numbers meant nothing, were placeholder numbers, weren't a plan at all despite the title. Cassandra let that answer sit in the room for a long moment before asking her next question, and I remember thinking, watching from the other room, that the silence itself was doing more work than anything Cassandra could have said. Cassandra then asked her, directly, whether she remembered a conversation with Marcus Del Rey on or around March 3rd. Renata said she didn't recall the specific date. Cassandra showed her the security footage still frame, the red coat, the timestamp. Renata's attorney asked for a break. When they came back 20 minutes later, Renata's answers had changed register completely, shorter, flatter, her attorney interjecting more frequently to object or clarify, and I understood, watching that shift happen in real time, that somewhere in that 20-minute break, her own legal team had realized exactly how much trouble the spreadsheet and the footage together actually represented, and had started preparing her and themselves for the plea negotiations that would eventually follow. 7 months later. I want to talk about Diego for a moment, because his part in this is smaller than Renata's, but not nothing, and because what happened to him afterward is, in its own quiet way, one of the sadder threads of this whole story. Diego was never charged criminally. The forensic accounting made clear that he hadn't participated in the forgery itself and likely hadn't known, at least not with certainty, where the down payment money for the lake house had actually come from, though the civil claim I filed against him argued, successfully enough that he settled rather than risk trial, that he'd had more than enough reason to ask questions he chose not to ask. A man doesn't usually receive $214,000 in cash for a lake house down payment from his wife's family estate, 6 weeks after his mother-in-law's funeral, without wondering, even a little, where exactly that number came from and why it arrived so quickly. Diego and Renata separated 4 months after the sentencing. I heard about it the way you hear about most things in a family that's been broken this specific way, secondhand, through Mateo mentioning offhandedly during one of our rare visits that Dad has his own apartment now. I don't know the full story of their marriage's collapse, and I don't think it's mine to know, but I do know that Diego reached out to me once, about 8 months after the separation, a short, awkward email that said mostly that he was sorry, that he hadn't known what he thought he should have known, and that he hoped the kids could still have some version of a relationship with me even if things between the adults stayed complicated. I wrote back one sentence. I never blamed the kids for any of this, and I never will. We haven't spoken much since, but Mateo still texts me sometimes, mostly about soccer, and I answer every single one. The sentencing hearing itself, 7 months after the civil ruling, is a day I remember in strange, disconnected fragments rather than as one continuous scene, the way I understand trauma sometimes gets stored, not as a story, but as pieces. I remember the specific gray of the sky that morning. I remember Cassandra asking me, the week before, whether I wanted to give a victim impact statement, and telling me there was no wrong answer, that plenty of people in my position chose not to. That it wouldn't change the sentencing guidelines much either way given the plea agreement already in place. I decided to write one anyway, not for the judge, though the judge did read it and referenced it briefly before handing down the sentence, but mostly, I think now, for myself. I don't remember every word of what I said that day, and I've chosen not to keep a copy, which might surprise you given how much of this story is built on things I kept, receipts and boarding passes and photocopied notes from a shoebox. But I remember the last line, because I'd rehearsed it more than any other part, standing in my bathroom mirror the night before, trying to get the tone right, not angry, not pleading, just true. I said, I don't need the court to make my sister love me. I only needed it to make her stop stealing from me while pretending that she did. Judge Aconcagua Reyes, according to Cassandra, made a small note next to that sentence in her printed copy of the statement, though I never found out what the note said, and some part of me prefers not knowing. After the sentencing, there was a period of almost total silence, nearly 5 months, where Renata and I had no contact at all, not a text, not a call, nothing passed even through Diego or the kids. I spent a good portion of that silence in Dr. Price's office, unpacking, slowly, the difference between the grief I'd expected to feel after losing my mother and the entirely separate grief I was now carrying for a sister who was, technically, still alive. Still living 20 minutes from me, and still, in every way that mattered, someone I had lost completely. It was during that 5-month silence that I found the shoebox, clearing out the last of our mother's attic before the estate house finally sold, sitting exactly where it had always sat, on the top shelf of the closet in what used to be our shared childhood bedroom before our mother converted it into a sewing room sometime in my 20s. I sat on the floor of that empty room for almost 2 hours going through it, note by note, and I want to be honest that it wasn't entirely painful. Some of the notes made me laugh out loud, alone, in an empty house that no longer belonged to anyone in our family. One, written in Renata's 9-year-old handwriting, simply said, I will never let anyone be mean to you, I promise. This is a real promise, not a fake one. I photocopied that one twice, once for the folder I would eventually bring to her door, and once for myself. And the second copy is still in a drawer in my desk, though I haven't looked at it in over a year. There's one more scene from the courtroom I haven't described yet, the cross-examination of Marcus Del Rey by Renata's own attorney, because I think it's the moment the entire defense strategy quietly collapsed in front of everyone in that room, including, I suspect, Renata herself. Her attorney, a tall, silver-haired man named Preston Call, who had clearly built a career on projecting unshakable confidence, tried to paint Marcus as an unreliable witness, someone testifying against Renata purely to save his own license and avoid prosecution, someone whose account couldn't be trusted because he had every incentive to lie. It was, on paper, a reasonable strategy. Cassandra had warned me it would happen, told me not to be alarmed when it did, that this was simply what a competent defense attorney was supposed to try. But Preston made a mistake, one small mistake, asking Marcus one question too many, the kind of question trial lawyers are taught never to ask, because you should never ask a question you don't already know the answer to. He asked Marcus whether he had any physical proof, beyond his own testimony, that Renata had specifically told him the signature belonged to me, as opposed to some other explanation for why he'd notarized a document without meeting the signer. Marcus, who by that point had clearly decided that his best path forward was total, unflinching honesty in exchange for whatever leniency it might buy him, reached into a folder his own attorney had prepared and produced a text message exchange between himself and Renata, one that Priyanka's subpoena of his phone records had already surfaced during discovery, but that Cassandra had strategically not introduced yet, saving it for exactly this moment. In the exchange, dated the day before the March 3rd notarization, Renata had written, "Just use the birthday card signature as reference. It's close enough that nobody will ever look twice. She trusts me completely. She'll never even check the will until everything's already filed." Marcus read that message aloud, in full, in a flat, almost apologetic voice, and I watched Preston Call's face go very still, the particular stillness of a lawyer realizing, in real time, in open court, that his own cross-examination question had just handed the prosecution its single most devastating piece of evidence. Cassandra told me afterward, in the hallway outside the courtroom, that she had known about that text message for nearly 2 months before the hearing and had deliberately not led with it, betting correctly. That Preston's confidence would eventually walk him into asking the exact question that would surface it organically, in a way that would land far harder coming from the defense's own witness than it ever could have coming from us. Sometimes, she said, the best thing you can do with a piece of evidence that strong is wait for the other side to hand it to you themselves. I've thought about that sentence more times than I can count in the years since, not just in relation to the case, but in relation to almost everything. I want to spend a little more time on what happened after, in the 2 years since the case fully closed, because I think endings like this one can feel, in the telling, like they arrive and then stop, and that isn't how real life actually works. The restitution payments came in slowly, in the structured installments the court had ordered, monthly deposits that showed up in my account with a kind of clinical regularity that never quite matched the emotional weight of what they represented. I remember the first payment arriving, for $1,200, a fraction of what was owed, and sitting at my kitchen table staring at the notification on my phone for a long time before I could bring myself to do anything else that day. Harold Feinstein retired 8 months after the sentencing, and at his retirement dinner, which I attended because he specifically asked me to, he pulled me aside near the end of the evening and told me something I hadn't expected. He said that in nearly 40 years of practicing estate law, he had seen exactly 2 cases as thoroughly and cleanly proven as mine, and that most families in situations like ours never get the kind of airtight evidence that makes a judge's ruling feel less like an opinion and more like an inevitable conclusion. You were lucky, he said, in the worst possible way, that you happen to be someone who keeps things. Most people would have deleted those texts by accident just scrolling through old conversations. You kept 9 years of a relationship without ever meaning to build a case with it, and it saved you. I've thought about that too, more than I expected to. There's something strange about being told that a habit you never thought of as meaningful, just keeping old messages because deleting them felt unnecessary, turned out to be the exact thing that saved $1.88 million and, more importantly, Saved me from spending the rest of my life not knowing what actually happened. Priya, the property manager, stayed on with the new ownership group after I sold my share of the company, and she still emails me every few months, mostly just to check in, sometimes to tell me about one of the buildings, a new tenant, a renovated lobby. Small updates about a version of my mother's legacy that I no longer have any financial stake in but still, apparently, can't fully let go of hearing about. I think that's its own kind of answer to a question I used to ask myself constantly during those 11 weeks of pretending everything was fine. What was I actually protecting, the money or the meaning behind it? I sold the money's worth of stake in those buildings. I kept somehow all of the meaning. Cassandra and I still get lunch about twice a year, which isn't something either of us expected when we started, given that professional relationships like ours usually end cleanly the moment the final invoice is paid. She told me, at one of those lunches, almost a year after the case fully closed, that she thought about my case more than almost any other she'd handled, not because of the dollar amount she'd handled larger, but because of how ordinary the beginning of it had looked. Most of the fraud I see, she said, starts with someone who is already a little bit of a stranger to the family before the theft even happened. Yours didn't. Yours started with someone who was, by every account, actually there, actually present, actually loved. That's the part that stays with me. I didn't have anything to say back to that. I still don't, really. As for Renata, I know only what filters through occasionally, through Mateo's texts about soccer, through the rare, stilted email from Diego. I know she moved into a smaller rental about a year after the sentencing. I know she completed her probation requirements without incident, according to the one time Cassandra checked in on the case status for me, unprompted, just to let me know. I don't know if she's ever opened the folder again since that day on the porch. I don't know if she still has it at all. I've stopped needing to know, which took longer to arrive at than I expected, and which I don't think would have arrived at all without 2 years of Dr. Price gently, patiently helping me understand that closure isn't something someone else hands you at the end of a court case. It's something you eventually build for yourself, out of whatever pieces are left standing once the case is over and the money is finally where it was always supposed to be. The buildings are still there, all 11 of them, under new ownership now, still standing on the same street corners they've stood on since a woman in her one good blazer convinced a banker named Walter to bet on her. I drive past the Ash Grove building sometimes, the one with the roof that first tipped me off that something had changed, and I think about my mother, and about fairness, that word she kept reaching for at her kitchen table with a legal pad and a pen, crossing out numbers, writing them again, trying so hard to make sure her daughters never fought over what she'd built. She never got to see how that fight actually unfolded. Some days I think that's the only mercy in this whole story. She never had to watch it happen. I think I owe you one more piece of the story before I close it out, because it's the part one understand least myself, even now, and maybe that's exactly why it belongs here instead of being quietly left out. About 14 months after the porch scene with the folder, I got a letter in the mail, an actual letter, handwritten, no return address. Though I recognized the handwriting immediately because I'd spent 2 years staring at photocopies of it in a manila folder. It was from Renata. Cassandra had warned me, back when the criminal case first closed, that this kind of thing sometimes happens, that people who've been through what my sister went through often reach a point, months or years later, where they attempt some form of contact, and that I was under no obligation whatsoever to respond, or even to read it if I didn't want to. I read it. I want to be honest that I read it 4 times before I decided what I thought about it. The letter didn't ask for forgiveness, exactly, which surprised me. It didn't try to explain the spreadsheet or the notary or the text message about the birthday card signature. Mostly, it talked about Mateo and Sophia, about how Sophia had started asking why Tia didn't come to things anymore, about how Renata didn't know what to tell her that wouldn't either lie to a 7-year-old or tell her something no 7-year-old should have to carry. Near the end, there was one line that I've thought about more than almost anything else in this entire story, more even than the spreadsheet or the boarding pass. She wrote, "I don't expect you to believe this, and I don't think I'd believe it either if I were you, but I think some part of me actually believed, while I was doing it, that I was going to fix it before it mattered. That I'd pay you back quietly before you ever had to know, and I think that's the version of the story I told myself every single day for almost a year, and I don't know when exactly it stopped being true, or if it was ever true at all. I didn't write back right away. I sat with that letter for almost 3 weeks, which is longer than I sat with almost any other single piece of evidence during the entire 2-year process, longer than the spreadsheet, longer than the boarding pass. Eventually, I did write back, for sentences, nothing more. I told her that Sophia could send me a drawing sometime if she wanted to, that I would always answer. I told her that I didn't know if I believed what she'd written about intending to pay it back, and that I'd probably never know for certain, and that I'd made a kind of peace with not knowing. I told her the restitution payments were still arriving on schedule, and that I appreciated that much, at least, being handled without complication. And I told her that the folder I'd left on her porch 14 months earlier wasn't an ending, it was just the last thing I had left to give her that was true, and that whatever came after that was going to have to be built by her, slowly. The same way trust gets built by anyone, one small, verifiable thing at a time, the same way I imagine our mother built that company, one brick at a time, one loan officer at a time, 1 year at a time, with nothing handed to her. And nothing assumed. We've exchanged maybe 6 letters since then, spread out over the better part of a year. It's not a relationship, not yet, maybe not ever again in the shape it used to have. But it's not silence either, and I think, for now, that's the most honest place the two of us can actually stand. Sophia sent a drawing about 2 months after that first letter, a crayon picture of what I think was supposed to be our mother's old house, the one with the tomato garden, though the tomatoes were drawn enormous, bigger than the house itself. The way children draw the things that matter most to them out of any reasonable proportion. I have it on my refrigerator. I don't know what that means exactly in terms of where this story actually ends. I've stopped needing every part of my life to resolve into a clean ending, which I think might be the truest thing this entire 2 years actually taught me, truer even than anything about forged signatures or notary logs or boarding passes. I still keep the shoebox on the shelf next to the framed boarding pass. I've thought, more than once, about whether that's strange, keeping the evidence of the worst betrayal of my life sitting 6 inches away from the evidence of the childhood that came before it. But I've decided it isn't strange at all. I think it's actually the most honest arrangement I could have made. Both things are true. Both things happened. The sister who wrote, "I will never let anyone be mean to you, I promise. This is a real promise, not a fake one in round, uneven 9-year-old handwriting." And the sister who sat across from a notary in a strip mall and paid him $3,000 in cash to forge my signature on a document that would have taken almost $2 million from me without a second thought, were, somehow, impossibly, the same person the entire time. I don't think I'll ever fully reconcile those two versions of her. I've stopped trying to. Some days that feels like giving up. Most days. Now, it just feels like the truth. I haven't told you yet about the exact moment I opened that folder in Cassandra's office and saw the amended will for the first time with my own eyes, rather than just hearing about it over the phone from Harold, and I think it deserves its own space here, because it's the single sharpest memory of this entire 2 years, sharper even than the courtroom, sharper than the porch. Cassandra slid the document across her desk without saying anything, letting me read it myself instead of summarizing it for me, which I understood later was deliberate. A way of making sure I absorbed the full weight of it rather than receiving a filtered version. I remember my eyes going straight to the percentages first, 78 and 12, the way you notice the wrong number on a receipt before you notice anything else about the page. Then I found the signature line, and I want to describe what that felt like as precisely as I can, because I think it's the moment that best explains everything that came after. It looked like my signature. That's the part that still unsettles me, more than a year later. Not close to my signature. Not a rough approximation. It looked, at a glance, exactly like the way I sign my name, the same small loop on the capital letter, the same slight downward slant toward the end that a handwriting analyst later confirmed. In a supplemental report Cassandra commissioned almost as a formality, was consistent with tracing from an authentic sample rather than freehand forgery. Marcus Del Rey had used the birthday card, just as he testified, and whoever actually produced the signature, whether it was Marcus himself or someone else entirely, a detail that was never fully resolved in the case, had done careful, patient work. It wasn't a sloppy crime. It was a precise one, which somehow made it worse. I sat in Cassandra's office holding that page for what she later told me was almost 4 full minutes without saying a single word, and she let me have all 4 of those minutes without interrupting, which I've come to understand, having now sat in a lot of lawyers' offices over 2 years, is rarer than it should be. When I finally spoke, the only thing I could think to say was, "She's better at handwriting than I am." Cassandra didn't laugh, but something in her expression softened slightly, and she said, "That's actually a very useful thing for you to have noticed, because it tells us this was planned, not improvised. People don't practice forging a signature they only intend to use once, on impulse." She was right, of course. The spreadsheet proved it months later. But in that moment, in her office, all I had was a piece of paper that looked exactly like my own handwriting attached to a lie I hadn't told. I think about that 4 minutes of silence often, actually, more than I expected to when I started telling this story. It was the exact midpoint between the sister I thought I had and the sister the next 2 years of evidence would eventually prove I actually had, a hinge point balanced on a single sheet of paper, and I remember thinking, somewhere in the middle of that silence, that whatever I decided to do next, whether I dropped everything and confronted her that same afternoon or whether I let Cassandra build the case slowly and carefully the way she was recommending, I was never going to be able to go back to not knowing. That specific kind of loss, the loss of the version of your life where you didn't know something yet, doesn't get talked about as much as the money or the courtroom drama, but I think it might be the realest loss in the entire story. The one no restitution payment or court ruling can ever actually restore. I chose to let Cassandra build the case slowly. I've never regretted that choice, even on the hardest days of those 11 weeks, even sitting in that school parking lot unable to make myself walk in and get Mateo. I think if I had confronted Renata that same afternoon, in anger, without the boarding pass, without the spreadsheet, without Marcus's testimony, without any of it, she would have had every opportunity to explain it away, to move the remaining money somewhere I could never trace it, to turn the whole thing into a he said, she said that a court might never have untangled with the same clarity. Patience, in this particular story, wasn't a virtue I chose because I'm a patient person. I'm not, particularly. It was a strategy, built by a very good lawyer, that happened to also be the only path that led to the truth actually mattering in the end, in a courtroom, on the record, where it couldn't be argued away or forgotten or smoothed over at another family barbecue. I want to tell you about the folder, the one I mentioned at the beginning, because that's really where this story ends for me, even though the legal process went on for almost 2 years total. 11 months after I first sat in that lawyer's office and learned my signature had been forged, and about 3 months after the criminal sentencing, I drove to Renata's house. Not the lake house, which was long gone by then, but the regular house, the one she and Diego had lived in the whole time, the one with the same porch swing that used to be at our mother's place before she died, moved over after the estate house was sold. Renata answered the door already looking tired, already looking like she expected another lawyer's letter, another court date, another piece of paper trying to take something else from her. I held out a plain manila folder. She looked at it, then at me, and there was something almost bitter in her voice when she said, "What is this, more paperwork? Haven't you taken enough?" I told her to open it. Inside was not paperwork. Inside was every note we had ever written each other and kept in that shoebox under our childhood bed, the folded paper scraps from when we were 11 and 13, the ones that said, "You're my best friend," and "I'll always have your back" in the round. Uneven handwriting of 2 girls who had no idea what any of those words would eventually cost. I had found the shoebox while clearing out our mother's attic during probate, sitting exactly where it had always sat, dust thick on the lid, and instead of throwing it away or keeping it hidden somewhere out of spite, I had photocopied every single note in order and put the copies in that folder, and I had written one line on a sticky note stuck to the front page. The line said, "I kept every word you ever gave me. I only wish you had done the same." Renata looked at the folder for a long time. She didn't laugh anymore. She didn't say anything at all, actually, not one word, and I didn't wait for her to find any. I turned around, walked back down the porch steps, past the swing that used to be our mother's, and got in my car. I still have the original shoebox. I don't know if I'll ever open it again. But I know exactly where it is, on a shelf in my own house now, next to the framed copy of the boarding pass Cassandra gave me after the case closed. The one that put me 900 miles away at the exact moment my sister decided I was worth less to her than a lake house and a down payment. Some people keep trophies of the things they've won. I think I keep this one as a reminder of the difference between the sister I thought I had and the one who was actually standing across that courtroom, staring at a table, refusing to look up. I sold my share of the property management company 18 months after everything settled, not because I couldn't have run it. Priya offered to help me take it over more than once. But because every one of those 11 buildings had my mother's handwriting somewhere in its history, in a margin note or an old maintenance log, and I found I couldn't look at any of them anymore without also seeing a courtroom, a boarding pass in a plastic sleeve, and a notary in a strip mall shaking as he testified. Harold helped me find a buyer, a small regional firm with a good reputation, and the sale closed for slightly more than the buildings had been valued at during probate, which felt, in its own quiet way, like my mother getting the last word. If you've made it this far, I think you already know the ending isn't really about the $1,880,000, even though that number is the reason any court in the country would even hear the case. It's about the 11 weeks I spent smiling through phone calls with someone who had already decided what I was worth, and the 2 years it took to prove, with boarding passes and security footage and a strip mall notary shaking testimony, that she was wrong.